Dear viewers, wherever you are, hello and welcome to this special interview as part of the annual celebration of the Egyptian Heritage Month in Canada that is organized and endorsed by the Canadian Egyptian Heritage Association. Egypt is the cradle of civilization. A civilization that goes back more than 11,000 years in history, since the very dawn of history, since the inception of civilization. This is an established fact that no one can deny or argue about. It was always a beacon for science, for art, and for culture. But on the other hand, another issue that has been always controversial is the Egyptian identity. Geographically speaking, Egypt connects Asia and Africa. It is also a southern Mediterranean country. It is also defined as a Middle Eastern or an Arabic country. So which one is Egypt? Is it an Asian country, an African country, an Arabic country, a southern Mediterranean country, or much more than that? To delve deeper into the crypts and to talk deeply and with more depth and to discuss thoroughly this issue, I'm really delighted to be accompanied now by Mr. Muhammad Sलماوي, who is our very distinguished guest today. He is a very prominent writer, thinker, and journalist. He is joining us now via Zoom from Cairo, Egypt. Mr. Muhammad, hello and welcome, and thank you very much for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just like I said in my intro, Egypt is the cradle of civilization. This is an established fact. No one can deny this or argue about. But like I said, it's geographically, it connects Asia to Africa. It's a Middle Eastern country. It's an Arabic country. It's a southern Mediterranean country. And moreover than that, Egypt had a very close encounter with almost all civilizations of the ancient, medieval, and modern world. Just to give an example, it had contact with the Persians, with the Assyrians, with the Babylonians, with the Romans, with the Greeks. Again, later on during the Middle Ages, it had contact with the Arabic culture, with the Turkish culture, with the Central Asian culture, and later on in the 18th and 19th century, had very close, encounters with the French and the British civilizations. So, how did these close encounters and this very special location of Egypt play a role in determining the character of Egypt?
Well, you're quite right in saying that Egypt has had all these connections, whether by geography or history or culture. These are the three aspects, the three domains where Egypt has had a lot of interchange with a lot of other cultures throughout its history that spans over thousands of years, as you have rightly pointed out. Egypt is not just one thing. Like all great civilizations, like all ancient countries, ancient nations, it's multifaceted, as you would say. It's got so many aspects that make up its identity that it's very simplistic to say Egypt is pharaonic. Although some people would like to say that. They'd like to say we have nothing to do with Africa, for instance, or we have nothing to do with the Arab world. And I prefer here the word Arab rather than Arabic. Arabic pertains more to the language, but Arab is more the ethnic appellation, in my opinion. So some people would say that, and they would be right, but it's not the whole truth, because side by side with that, Egypt has also been so many other things. Some people would like to say, as President Sadat used to say, wrongly, I think, that Egypt is an Islamic country. History teaches us that Egypt, in fact, was the first Christian country in the world. It is the Church of Alexandria, of St. Marcus, that was the first, that was the center of Christendom at one time, even before the Vatican came about. So to look at Egypt, you have to look at all these things at the same time. Egypt is definitely African. It is definitely Asian. Part of Africa, part of Egypt lies in Asia, which is Sinai. It is Arab, especially in culture, and also ethnically, because there has been a lot of interchanges and intermarriages between the inhabitants of all this area, which we now call the Arab world. Egypt also has a lot of ties with the Mediterranean. You remember, of course, during the Roman times and the Greek times, how Egypt went into very close interaction with the Rome of Julius Caesar, the famous love story between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, and later Antony, shows how close this relationship was. And at the same time, as you pointed out as well, it had a lot of interchange with the Persians, with the Turks, with the French, with the British, with almost every culture that existed around Egypt. There has been this interchange. And Egypt always came out enriched, even though there may have been political clashes, like we had with the French when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, or with the British when they occupied Egypt. But in fact, all this helped to show how strong Egyptian identity is. In fact, it was the Egyptian identity that invaded the French when Bonaparte came with his troops to Egypt. Look at what happened in France, what they call the Egyptomania, how they went back. They stayed in Egypt only 3 years, but they went back with so much Egyptian influence, which started what we now call Egyptology. Egyptology was born through the French campaign and the studies that were carried on by all these scientists and philosophers and thinkers who accompanied Napoleon's military.
20 years ago, an immigrant became an entrepreneur. A dream became a reality, and a country became home. Thank you, Canada, for embracing our craft and allowing us to share it with you. Osmos, we're making what you're craving.
And here comes a follow-up question here, like you exactly pointed out, like for example, the See of St. Mark started in Alexandria, Egypt, and was a beacon for all the Christian, thought and intellect throughout the world. So Egypt was a beacon, again, in the spiritual side with St. Mark. We had the Greco-Roman period, the Ptolemaic Egypt as well, and But I just want to stop at the very last point that you pointed out here when you said that instead of being only influenced by the invader or by the visitor or whoever you want to call, it also greatly affected them. So even before Napoleon, Alexander the Great used to pay tribute to the pharaonic gods, not the Greek or Macedonian gods. Same thing then later on with Napoleon and some of his great commanders, and as well like with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and so on. What is the secret? Like what is the secret that makes the Egyptian culture sort of seep through every pore, just invades the invader? How did this happen?
I think it is mainly the richness of this culture, which makes it stand out so much more than many other ancient civilizations. In comparison, without naming any of them, but in comparison with many of the other civilizations, you find that they were more or less monolithic, if you like, whereas Egypt, as we said, was very multifaceted. And this increases the richness of this civilization and makes it so absorbing and so fascinating. I'm glad you mentioned the example of Alexander the Great, because some people would tell you that, well, he adopted, the name, a pharaonic name when he invaded Egypt, and he used to even wear Egyptian dress. But was that a means to endear himself to the Egyptians? Actually, history proves the opposite, because it is historically known that Alexander the Great, who died in Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq, if you like, left in his will that he would like to be buried in Egypt, which shows how much he loved Egypt, how much he was affected by Egyptian civilization. And in adopting so many Egyptian customs and names and titles, he was not only trying to endear himself with the Egyptians, but it was a real feeling he had for this ancient civilization. And it is historically recognized that after he died, his corpse left Mesopotamia on the way to Egypt to be buried in Egypt. And of course, his tomb was never found. But there are some reports by some of the travelers in Roman times who said that they visited the tomb of Alexander the Great in Alexandria, not in Sinai, as he had asked. You know, the famous story he had with the oracle in the temple of Sinai, where he was asked, he had some doubts about his parentage, and he asked the oracle, who is my father? And the oracle told him, you are the son of Ammon, which is the Egyptian god. It may, of course, have been the priest hiding behind the curtain who said that. But anyway, it affected Alexander the Great so much, and he thought of himself as the son of this Egyptian god. And he thought of himself as an Egyptian and asked that he be buried in Egypt after he died. This kind of influence that Egypt had all the way from Alexander the Great to Napoleon shows how rich this civilization has been and still is, actually, although not so much light is now shed on modern Egyptian culture and civilization. But if you look at so many aspects of Egyptian life now, look at the art movement in Egypt. I remember only a few years ago, Egypt won first prize in the Biennale Art Festival of Venice. Whenever people approach Egypt's culture and its heritage and its modern civilization as well, they never cease to be fascinated by the richness of this culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. And here comes my question, which is, for multicultural societies, there are usually like two systems or two paradigms, two structures. So there is a structure that is called the melting pot, where all the different cultures, they come into that pot, they melt, and they just create an alloy of all these cultures combined together. Now there is another example, which Canada is a living manifestation of, which is the salad bowl, where you bring all the cultures, but each distinct culture is obvious still. So in a salad bowl, I cut the tomatoes, the lettuce, the cucumbers, but although they're together in the same bowl, but I can still see each one separately. There is also the very ethnocentric culture that perceives and judges everything through its own, they are very, very despotic, and I would say again, they have a lot of bigotry, so they only see the good through their own eyes. They are the frame of reference. They cannot accept any other, reference. While on the other hand, there is the culture relativist society, which says that everything is relative. The right way can be this, the right way can be that. Which one is Egypt? Is it a melting pot or a salad bowl?
I think neither one nor the other. It is neither the American formula of the melting pot, nor is it the Canadian formula, of which I'm very fond. When I visited Canada, it was a pleasure to travel from Montreal to Ontario to Vancouver and witness all this richness. It's a very rich tapestry where you can easily distinguish between different colors in this tapestry. The red is there, the blue, the green, all of it. With Egypt, I think it's a different story. It's more like the human being. A human being, when you analyze anybody's DNA, even that of certain peoples who during one or the other of their, one period or the other of their history used to think that they are a pure race, it was found out that there's no such thing as a pure race. And to analyze the DNA of any one human being, you will find traces of different ethnic components. And this is a bit similar. I like to think of Egypt culture in those terms, that it has absorbed all these different cultures and ethnicities that it has come across throughout its thousands of years of history. And a new identity has evolved. I wouldn't say new in terms that it's a breakaway from the old pharaonic identity. I think it's more of a modification. Every time a new element is introduced.
So I think it's like an increment, just like an addition to what already exists?
It's an addition to what exists. It affects what exists without obliterating it, enriches it, and you can easily find the components of each of these civilizations in our present civilization. If you take the language as an example, we speak Arabic, but so many words were taken from Persian. Many words go back to pharaonic times.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Or all these 11,000 years that you have mentioned in your intro.
Exactly.
There are many Italian words. There are many English or French words also. And I think the language is a mirror of what our civilization is like. But at the basis of all this, there is this particularly Egyptian identity, which makes it different from any other identity pertaining to any other civilization.
بيشرفنا وبيسعدنا ان نشارككم بشهر التراث المصري. الحقيقه خطوه جميله وايجابيه، وبمناسبه دي بنحب نعرفكم انه مكتبنا هنا بيقدم لكم كل الخدمات العقاريه، شراء بيع ايجار استثمار، حتى البري كونستراكشن. الحقيقه دي ما متاحه بالسوق، لكن علاقتنا الطيبه مع البيلدر بنقدر نقدمها لكم. وان شاء الله لما بتشرفونا بالشهر التراث المصري بنقدم لكم هديه جميله، وبنتمنى لكم كل النجاح، وبنقول لكم حبابكم 10 بلا كشره.
So throughout the ages, Egypt had many encounters with different cultures and so on, but some people would like to refer to the 1920s, the 1930s and 40s as the golden age, not only of multiculturalism, but also of intellect. And people started to think out of the box. A lot of innovation was there. And of course, before that, Egypt was one of the very first leading countries in the Middle East to have, people travel and study and acquire knowledge from all the different advanced civilizations in the world. But a lot of people, again, would argue that unfortunately, something hit, or like the Egyptian identity was attacked by a very severe virus. I wouldn't say that this virus was so evil that it forced us to amputate some parts of the culture, but it undermined some parts of the culture, and some parts of the cultures of the Egyptian culture were marginalized due to many political conflicts that happened in the region from the 1950s and onwards. To what extent do you agree with this?
I don't know what you mean exactly by virus, because we've had so many viruses, last of COVID-19. But we in Egypt, in terms of our civilization, we've had so many challenges. The biggest challenge to our identity was, of course, Islamic fundamentalism. And this did not start in the 50s, as you say, but it started with the 70s. Unfortunately, under President Sadat, who, almost encouraged that Islamic revival, thinking that it was one way of, countering leftist trends, Nasserism and Marxism and all the other leftist ideas.
So socialism, pan-Arabism, and all these different slogans that were very prominent during the 50s and 60s.
That's right. This has, when you release the genie out of the pot, you cannot put him back again in the jar. And this is what happened. This movement was released. This movement attained, unexpected dimensions. And we've had the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a movement that started in 1928 in Egypt, but it was always contained. It was always in second place, because at that time, 1928, the Egyptians were more leaning towards patriotism, nationalism, in their attempt to get rid of British occupation. And it was not so much religion, but nationalism, attaining independence from the British. And it was always in second place. Under Nasser in the 50s and 60s, as you said, Arab nationalism and Arab unity. In the 70s, we saw the rise of this movement, which has been with us ever since, unfortunately. And Sadat is on record as having said, "I am a Muslim leader of a Muslim country," which is actually not true, because we have Christians in Egypt. We, as I said, was the first Christian country that history has known, officially Christian country. We have had so many invasions and action with so many cultures.
So can I just stop you here for a second? Because if we're talking again about religion here, again, we had a very, very successful and a very rich component of the Egyptian culture, which were the Jewish Egyptians. And unfortunately, we lost this component due to many conflicts in the Middle East after the 1948 war, the tripartite aggression in 56, 67 war. All these things, with a lot of political propaganda, raised a lot of anti-Jewish sentiments in the hearts of Egyptians and in media and propaganda and so on. And this led to the loss of this great part and component of the Egyptian culture. How do you see this?
Well, it was a result of the political situation that existed. Before the establishment of Israel, there was no conflict between, I wouldn't say Egyptians, and Jews at all. In fact, as you probably well know, many Jews fled the persecution that they faced in Europe and came to the Arab world, where they lived, very peacefully. Many of them didn't come from Europe at all, but were, Egyptians, full-fledged Egyptians who were born in Egypt and knew no other country. But with the establishment of the State of Israel, with the Jewish state, and the call of Israel at the time to all Jews in the world to owe allegiance to the newly born Jewish state and to immigrate. Ben Gurion is on record having said that all Jews who do not come to Israel are, I think he used the word traitor or something very close to them. This was the call at the time. It's no longer the case now. But it's understandable, when the state was still newly founded, they wanted as many people to come in and reside in it. And this created a very awkward situation to the Jews living in the Arab world and, especially Egypt as well. Where is their allegiance? Is their allegiance to Egypt, where they have lived all their lives, or is it to the newly established Jewish state, which was in conflict at the time with the Arab world? Many of them decided to immigrate to Israel and left Egypt. Others did not and thought they belonged in Egypt. But more and more they started feeling how awkward their situation was, and the general patriotic feeling at the time in Egypt was causing them. And of course, many of them had foreign nationalities, apart from the Egyptian. Many of them, had to leave or were asked even to leave because all British and French nationals were asked to leave after the aggression of 1956, when Britain and France attacked Egypt. So as a result of all this, we lost this component. It so happened that we were about to lose another important component, which are the Christians of Egypt at the time of the, when we were under Muslim Brotherhood rule, after the Arab Spring events, and we were under Muslim Brotherhood rule. This, how shall I say, this very fundamentalist trend became very strong, and there were a lot of attacks on Christians and on churches, and if we had carried on like this, we would have been turned, for the first time in the history of Egypt, into a religious state. Egypt was never a religious state. So there was this danger that faced it's one of the biggest dangers and challenges that our identity faced also during those years. The head of the Muslim Brotherhood once said, when they told him Egypt, he said what amounts to hell with Egypt.
Yep.
In Arabic, Toz for Masr, which means, I couldn't care a hoot for Egypt. And in saying so, he was symbolizing the ideology and the basic doctrine of the Muslim Brotherhood, which believes in the Islamic nation and not in nationalism or in patriotism or in belonging to one single country, but belonging to the nation of Islam. So a Muslim living in Afghanistan or they think is closer to them than a Christian living next door. Whereas in fact, if you look culturally, there's no difference culturally at all between an Egyptian Muslim and an Egyptian Christian. And Lord Cromer, a High Commissioner of Britain, in his memoirs, he said, I found out during my stay in Egypt that the only difference between a Muslim and a Christian is that Muslims pray in the mosque, whereas Christians pray in the church. But they have the same traditions, the same habits, the same national character, if you like. All this was under threat when we had this one-year rule of Muslim Brotherhood in 2012.
Gray zone, red zone, orange zone, yellow zone, green zone. مصراوي معاك في أي لون وفي أي زون.
So here comes a very important question. Although, like you rightly said, Egypt was never a theocracy per se, but during the time of the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood or of their political arm, when they came into power, although it stayed for only 1 year, but it created a lot of turmoil and it created a major crack actually in the Egyptian identity, and it was against the Egyptian identity, and that's why they were toppled just 1 year later. Again, we previously talked about the Jewish Egyptians who are mostly like Mizrahi Jews, but we also had the Ashkenazim, we also had the Sephardims as well in Egypt who felt very much at home. The question here is, although Egypt was not and is not a theocracy per se, but religion is also part of the Constitution. Would you say that secularism would be the ideal formula, the antidote against any future threats like that? And I just want to clarify something here, because in popular culture, in people's mind, they usually misinterpret the word secularism, and they think it's interchangeable with atheism, which is absolutely not true. So secularism, like Canada is a secular country, but everybody can, practice their faith fully and freely. And actually, any attack on any faith is faced with full power of the state. But at the same time, faith and religion has no say in the Constitution or in the rules. Again, secularism totally separates. It's the rule of merit, and the choice is based on merit, only on merit. So regardless of the color of your skin, your ethnic group, your cultural background, your faith, nothing will affect the choice if you really have the capacity and the ability to get the job done. Do you think that this is the antidote that Egypt would need now?
Well, you have just said that religion is not in the constitution, but in Egypt, as you probably well know, it is.
Yeah.
And the second item, immediately, the second item in the constitution, and it was introduced under Sadat. Previously, throughout the history of Egyptian consecutive Egyptian constitutions, we never had a stipulation that Egypt is an Islamic country.
Mm-hmm.
But Sadat introduced that into the constitution for the first time. Our first constitution was back in 1923. And even before that, under Khedive Ismail, there were, a precursor of our constitution. And they all were more or less secular documents that spoke about people's rights, their obligations, all these things that constitutions speak about. But under Sadat, this item was introduced. After the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood rule, a new constitution was written. I had the privilege and the honor of being a member of the Committee of 50 that wrote this new constitution. And we were able to amend this one item in the constitution. And instead of saying that Egypt is an Islamic country and the Sharia is the main source of its legal system, we said it is a major source. In other words, it is not the only source of its legislation, of its legal system, which allowed us to introduce other concepts into other more secular concepts into the constitution. And we wrote a constitution that lays the foundation of the secular state without naming it, because of this one item which we were unable to remove. So strong, and the religious trend had become so well entrenched in society over 40 years under Sadat and later under Mubarak, that to remove it would have amounted in people's general perception as saying that Egypt is an atheist country, as you just pointed out a minute ago. So, but we stated, for instance, all what you just said about Canada. We said that the freedom of prayer is guaranteed, and each believer has the right to practice his or her religion freely And, you know, all these things were there. And these things are what makes a real secular state. So the basics of a secular state are there in our new constitution. And the country, ever since the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood, has been moving more or less towards this model. The widespread following of the Muslim Brotherhood is no longer there. You know that prior to their rule, many people believed in the Muslim Brotherhood because they were never put to the test. And people said, why don't we try? We've tried socialism, we've tried capitalism, we've tried everything. Why don't we try the Muslim Brotherhood? They are people who believe in God, they believe in justice. If they rule, there will be no corruption, there will be social justice and all that. We were all surprised, well, even shocked, I dare say, when they ruled at the amount of corruption, the lack of knowledge of how to rule the country, and after 1 year, people rose above them. And it was no coincidence that it was the intellectuals who know so much about national identity, the intellectuals who are the guardians of national identity. It was them that led the revolt. I remember we had a big march. At that time, I was the head of the Writers' Union of Egypt. And we led a march to the Ministry of Culture. We had a sit-in at the office of the minister, who was appointed by the Muslim Brotherhood. We refused to have him enter the ministry. And we stayed there for about a month, at the end of which the Muslim Brotherhood rule fell. So we felt this threat. They couldn't support Egyptian culture or civilization. There were calls by members of the Muslim Brotherhood that we had to cover all ancient Egyptian statues because they were idols. They closed the opera house and kicked out the director of the opera, who incidentally happens to be the Minister of Culture now.
Which is very abominous and very out of context, because when the first Muslims came to Egypt, all the monuments and temples and the pyramids and the Sphinx and the obelisks and all these things were there, and they never broke any one of them. So it's totally out of context. They are creating a new belief system for themselves.
Yes, I mean, at the Arab invasion, a lot of Egyptians remained Christian.
Absolutely.
They were not changed their religion, and they remained Christian up till this very day. So it was very strange to see that. And then, it becomes self-defeating, and this fundamentalist trend becomes, with time, narrower and narrower every day. And the Sunnis, who are the Muslim Brotherhood, they are Sunnis, they even not only turned against Christians, but started turning against Shiites, who are fellow Muslims. And Shiites were dragged in the streets, in the open streets, in front of everybody. No, we've gone through a lot under Muslim.
And fellow Sunni Muslims too, like any Muslim who's not a Brotherhood member is not a brother. Like the term itself is absurd and very, very abominous, and is preposterous actually, brotherhood. So like only us, as if they totally confiscated and monopolized Islam.
That's true, but of course, after 10 years, the general feeling is different. The Muslim Brotherhood lost a great deal, if not the majority of their popular support. They still have their members, of course, who have become a minority in society. People wouldn't dream of voting for the Muslim Brotherhood anymore. They've seen the atrocities that were committed by the Muslim Brotherhood and the blood that was shed during this 1 year, the inefficiency of their rule, and no, it was a nightmare. And since then, I think Egypt has been evolving. There has been an increased awareness of the real culture and civilization of Egypt. I don't know whether in Canada you saw lately the great parade we had in the streets.
Absolutely, absolutely. Everyone watched with full awe, actually. It was like a masterpiece.
And it reminded, it symbolized, you know, what Egyptians felt. And the way Egyptians looked at that tells you how much people cherish their old civilization and were proud and happy and felt at home with this grand royal parade, that the whole world was in awe when they witnessed it. And it is a symbol of what Egypt has become after 10 years of the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood rule.
In our school, we don't educate young people just to become any person, but we make sure we help them shape their personalities to become the best they can be as tomorrow's leaders.
Mr. Shelmawi, last but never least, and you are always very close to the extremely prominent writer and Nobel winner, Mr. Naguib Mahfouz, the late writer that won the Nobel Prize for all of his great writings. And you always had a very special interest in him. Unfortunately, again, many of the extremist forces used to say that his writings were abominous, they were atrocious, they were anti-religious, he's an infidel, and they just used to call him like all kinds of negative, words that they used to associate with him. What did the world see in the writings of this great writer, Naguib Mahfouz, to grant him the Nobel Prize? Especially that everyone knows that Naguib Mahfouz was very, very Egyptian.
He was very Egyptian, and hence, and as a result, he was very secular as well. Mm-hmm. And he was very tolerant. In fact, there is a famous story that he was named after a Coptic gynecologist who, Naguib Pasha Mahfouz, was a very famous gynecologist, and he was the one who helped Naguib Mahfouz's mother give birth to Naguib Mahfouz. So she chose to name him after this Coptic famous gynecologist. It is all these extremists who called him an infidel and who called him, anti-Islamic and all that. And there was a fatwa, very much like the Ayatollah fatwa against Salman Rushdie, that was issued by a blind sheikh who actually was given asylum in the United States of America. When he was called to justice in Egypt, the United States hastened to give him a political asylum. And from his safe haven in the States, he issued this fatwa, and he said something that amounted to, had we dealt with Naguib Mahfouz properly when he wrote his book, Children of Jebelawi, Salman Rushdie would not have dared write his satanic verses. And this was a clear directive to the Islamic terrorist groups we have in Egypt to deal properly, between inverted commas, with Naguib Mahfouz. And they attacked him. And God willed otherwise. He was not killed. He was saved. But unfortunately, he lost the ability to use his right hand for a while. But he was dictating. And he lived from 94 to 2006, where he wrote lovely little pearls, which he called dreams of convalescence. And Naguib Mahfouz, unlike what these religious nuts used to think of him, was, embodied all the intrinsic qualities of what makes an Egyptian Egyptian. He was a very docile man with a lot of pride, but very modest. He had a sense of humor. He was very humane. He was all the things that make up what it is to be Egyptian. Very proud and quite aware of his ancient culture and civilization. In fact, his first 3 novels ever were 3 novels about ancient Egypt and inspired by the history of ancient Egypt. And people felt very proud when he got the Nobel Prize. I was privileged to have been chosen by him to be his personal representative in Stockholm and read out his Nobel lecture on this occasion. And I came back, to find the country in festivities, because they were very proud that one of their writers, who was already very popular with Egyptians at the time, and many of his novels were turned into films, that people saw and loved and knew.
And not only Arabic films, even Spanish and Latin America, and he was international.
That's true. And his works were hence translated into almost all the languages of the world, and in fact into many dialects as well, since he got the Nobel Prize in 1988.
Mr. Mohammed Shelmawy, at the end of this interview, I really can't thank you enough. It was a lot of great information, and it was a real pleasure having with you, this interview. And we really look forward to having you sometime here in Canada with us to witness the celebration of the Egyptian Heritage Month and have firsthand experience with us here.
Well, I know Canada very well, and I've visited a number of times, actually from coast to coast. And I've been invited, I was honored to be invited as a guest of honor at the Salon du Livre of Montreal, twice actually. And I'm very happy, even though I can't be with you now in Canada, but very happy to take part in this month of Egyptian heritage, of which I'm very proud and very happy that you were able to set this tradition, which I expect that you would carry on from year to year. And maybe after we get rid of COVID-19, the COVID-19 nightmare, we would be able to join you and celebrate with you this 1 month. Let me congratulate you all on what you're doing, and wish you and all the Egyptians and the Canadian people, who are a lovely people, wish them all the best for the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure, and really looking forward to having the honor of hosting you here very soon. Thank you very much again, Mr. Mohammed Sलमावी, joining us via Zoom from Cairo, Egypt. And dear viewers, at the end of this interview, just to recap, Egypt was and will always be the cradle of civilization. And at the core of the Egyptian identity is multiculturalism. It is always a culture that has this international perspective. It is, the mixture of all the human heritage combined, with the Egyptian flavor definitely over that. It is always a very welcoming civilization. Nobody feels like a stranger in Egypt. Everybody feels at home. We had many, many great prominent people, like, for example, Dalida, the international famous singer. She is of Italian origin, but she grew up in Egypt as a typical Egyptian. Demis Roussos, the singer, his mother Nili Mazloum as well. Greeks, but who grew up as Egyptians. This also enables someone like Omar Sharif to easily, go and become an international superstar, because the world was not strange to Egypt, and Egypt is definitely never strange to the world. Egypt is the cradle of civilization, and it is the midland of the world where all cultures meet. So at the end of this interview, I wish you a very pleasant time, everyone. This was Mohammed Al-Hadri from the studios of the Egyptian Canadian Heritage Association here in Toronto. Until we meet again, have a very pleasant time. Thank you very much.